The Vrexian Dominion ruled 40% of the known galaxy, and they had done so for 3,000 years without anyone stopping them or even slowing them down for long. Their ships were massive constructs of dark metal that blotted out stars. When they arrived in a system, and their warriors stood 8 feet tall with obsidian scales that could deflect, most energy weapons and natural claws that could tear through steel doors, like wet paper, War Prime Vexcar stood on the bridge of the Dreadnought Eternal Conquest and watched the holographic display showing the spiral arm. They had just finished subjugating, with his amber eyes glowing with satisfaction at another campaign completed ahead of schedule the species there had called themselves the Pollux, and they had actually managed to destroy 3 Vrexian frigates before their resistance collapsed, which was more than most managed, but still pathetically inadequate against the might of the Dominion Thexcar, second in command. Approached with the cautious respect that all lower-ranked Vrexians showed their superiors, and waited for permission to speak, which Dexcar granted with a flick of his tail. War Prime, we have detected unusual signals from a system we catalogued. Approximately 400 years ago, the officer said while pulling up a star chart that showed a small yellow star in an unremarkable region of space. The system was designated as containing primitive life forms that had barely achieved chemical propulsion and were not expected to develop anything useful for at least another 1,000 years. Dexcar examined the data with growing interest because the signals were definitely artificial, and they showed mathematical complexity that suggested advanced civilization rather than the primitive broadcasts they had detected centuries ago. What sort of signals, he asked while zooming in on the third planet from the star, which the primitives apparently called Earth faster-than-light communication. War Prime, the officer replied with obvious confusion in his voice. But the species has not developed FTL travel according to our latest scans, which makes no sense, because every species discovers travel before they discover communication at such distances. This was indeed strange, because the technological progression of species throughout the galaxy followed predictable patterns, and the Vrexians had observed thousands of developing civilizations over the millennia, and none had ever achieved FTL communication without first achieving FTL travel. Sexcar felt something he had not experienced in decades, which was genuine curiosity about another species, because the Vrexians had long ago catalogued all the ways other races could fight and die, and nothing surprised them anymore. How long would it take us to reach this system? He asked, while studying the primitive settlements visible on the planet's surface through their long-range scans. 17 days at standard cruise. War Prime, the officer answered promptly. The War Prime considered this, and then made his decision with the casual authority of someone who had commanded fleets for 60 years. Set course for this Earth, and prepare a subjugation fleet, he ordered while turning back to the display. If these primitives have stumbled onto something useful, we will take it. And if they show promise as warriors, we will conscript them. And if they have nothing to offer, we will enslave them for labor, as we always do. The officer saluted and moved to carry out the orders, while Dexcar continued examining the data on humanity with growing fascination. The species was physically weak compared to Vrexians, with no natural armor or weapons, and they lived only a fraction of a Vrexian lifespan, which suggested they could barely accumulate useful knowledge before dying there. World was divided into hundreds of competing factions that fought each other constantly over resources and territory and ideology, which was typical of primitive species that had not yet unified under a single strong ruler. But their technology showed rapid advancement in the past century, which was unusual because most species took millennia to progress from chemical propulsion to anything approaching space colonization. These humans had gone from primitive aircraft to orbital stations in less than 100 years, and had apparently bootstrapped themselves to FTL communication through methods the Vrexian computers were still analyzing. Dexcar pulled up historical data on other species the Dominion had encountered at similar technological levels, and found that most had either submitted immediately upon seeing Vrexian superiority, or had fought brief, feudal wars before collapsing. Longest resistance had come from the Kethril, whose war had lasted almost 2 years before their military was completely destroyed, and their leaders executed as examples, he expected these humans would follow a similar pattern and would probably surrender as soon as they saw a Vrexian dreadnought in orbit, because that was what all intelligent species did when faced with overwhelming force. The Eternal Conquest and its escort fleet began the journey to Earth's system while Vexcar reviewed the subjugation protocols that had worked on thousands of other species across thousands of years. First would come the broadcast in multiple languages, demanding immediate surrender and recognition of Vrexian authority over their system. Then, if they refused, which some did, out of foolish pride, the Vrexians would demonstrate their power by destroying a military installation or small city to show that resistance was futile. After that, the species always surrendered because they realized they could not win, and that was the pattern that had held true across 40% of the galaxy. Without exception, Thex allowed himself a moment of anticipation, because even though this would undoubtedly end like all the others, the mystery of their FTL communication made it slightly more interesting than the usual routine conquest. His communication officer approached again with new data that had been collected during their approach to the system. War Prime, the humans appear to have detected our fleet, the officer reported. They are broadcasting messages in multiple languages, including Vrexian, which should be impossible because we have never contacted them. Before Vexcar's eyes narrowed, because this suggested the humans had encountered other species or had somehow intercepted Vrexian communications, which implied better technology than the scan suggested. What are they saying? He demanded while watching the tactical display update with new information about human defenses, which appeared minimal. They are requesting a diplomatic meeting, War Prime. Oh, the officer said, with clear amusement in his voice. They wish to discuss peaceful contact and cultural exchange at a neutral location. The bridge crew rippled with laughter, because the idea that these primitives thought they could negotiate as equals with the Vrexian Dominion was absurd beyond measure. Vexcar silenced them with a gesture and considered the request with cold calculation. It might be useful to meet with the humans before subjugating them, because he could learn about their FTL communication technology through conversation, rather than having to extract it from captured scientists later. Send a response, he ordered while settling back into his command throne. Tell them we will meet at the location they specify in 3 days, and inform them that this meeting will determine whether they die quickly or slowly. The message was sent, and Vexcar waited for the panicked response that always came when species realized they were facing the Dominion, but instead, the human reply was prompt and almost cheerful in tone. Excellent, we look forward to meeting you. The message said, please feel free to bring security personnel, and we will provide refreshments and comfortable seating for all attendees. Vexcar stared at the message for a long moment, because in 3,000 years of conquest, he had never received an invitation that mentioned refreshments and comfortable seating. These humans were either incredibly stupid or they knew something he did not, and the War Prime was suddenly very eager to find out which. The meeting station hung in space between Earth and Mars, and it had definitely not been there during the Vrexians' last scan of the system 400 years ago, which meant the humans had built it recently, and very quickly Vexcar studied the structure through the view screen as his shuttle approached, and had to admit it showed impressive engineering for a species that supposedly had barely mastered spaceflight. Station was a rotating wheel design that provided artificial gravity, and it bristled with communication arrays and docking ports and what looked like observation decks with large windows facing the stars. Security detail consisted of 12 elite warriors who wore full combat armor and carried plasma rifles that could punch through starship holes, and they flanked him as he walked through the docking tube into the human station. Interior was surprisingly pleasant, with soft lighting and walls painted in calming colors and artwork that depicted various Earth landscapes and what appeared to be historical scenes from human civilization. A delegation of 5 humans waited in the main conference room, and they stood as the Vexcar entered, which was the proper show of respect, though he doubted they understood the significance. The lead human was a female with dark skin and gray hair, who wore formal clothing that seemed designed to project authority without being militaristic, and she smiled as she approached. Welcome, War Prime Vexcar, she said in perfect Vrexian, which surprised him again, because learning their language should have taken years of study. I am Ambassador Chen of the United Earth Coalition, And these are my colleagues who represent our various nations and scientific institutions.
X-Card
Did not extend his hand because Vrexians did not touch species they considered inferior, and instead he simply nodded and moved to the large chair that had been prepared for his. Greater height, you speak our language well for a primitive species, he said while his guards took positions around the room with weapons ready. We have had access to Vrexian communication protocols for approximately 8 months, Chen replied while taking her own seat across from him. Your military transmissions are quite detailed, and we have learned much about your culture and history from them. This was alarming because it meant the humans had been intercepting and decoding Vrexian signals, which should have been impossible with their level of technology. But Dexkar kept his expression neutral. Then you know why I am here, he said, while leaning forward slightly. The Vrexian Dominion claims this system and all resources within it, including your species, and you will submit to our authority or be destroyed. The other humans in the room showed various reactions ranging from concern to what looked like barely suppressed amusement, but Ambassador Chen remained calm and thoughtful. We understand your position, she said carefully, but before we discuss such matters, might we offer you refreshment and perhaps learn more about each other as civilizations? One of the other humans brought forward a tray with various items, including what appeared to be processed foods and beverages, and Chen explained each one with enthusiasm. This is coffee, which is a stimulant beverage that humans consume socially. And this is chocolate, which is a sweet food made from plants native to Earth. These are various fruits that represent different regions of our world. Dexkar had no intention of consuming unknown substances, but he was fascinated by the humans' behavior because they acted as though this was a friendly meeting between equals. Rather than a subjugation, I did not come here to sample your food, he said with impatience creeping into his voice. I came to receive your surrender. Chen nodded as though he had said something reasonable, and then she began asking questions that completely derailed the conversation. Before we discuss surrender, might I ask about Vrexian culture? She said, while pulling out a small device that appeared to be a recording instrument. For instance, do your people have music, and if so, what instruments do you prefer, and what emotions do your songs typically express? Dexkar stared at her because, in 3,000 years of conquest, no species had ever asked about Vrexian music when facing extinction. We have war drums and victory chants, he answered automatically, while trying to understand what game she was playing, but that is irrelevant too. Fascinating, Chen interrupted with genuine interest in her eyes. And what about family structures? Because we have noticed that Vrexian ships carry multiple generations based on our analysis of your communication patterns. Another human spoke up with equal enthusiasm, asking about Vrexian literature and philosophy, and a third wanted to know about their cuisine and whether they had domesticated animals on their homeworld. Dexkar found himself answering their questions, despite his intention to simply deliver an ultimatum and leave, because the humans seemed genuinely curious rather than afraid. They asked about Vrexian childhood and education, and what Vrexians did for entertainment, and whether they had sports or games, and gradually the Dexkar realized something disturbing. These humans were not preparing for war or negotiating for survival, but instead they were trying to understand the Vrexians as people rather than as conquerors. Enough, he finally said, while standing to his full height, which made the humans look up at him, with their fragile necks craned. I will give you 30 days to prepare whatever defenses you wish. And then the Vrexian fleet will arrive, and you will either surrender or be crushed, and there will be no further discussion, Ambassador. Chen stood as well, and her expression became serious, though still not fearful. We would prefer to be friends, War Prime, she said quietly. We believe that cooperation between species benefits everyone, and that conflict is a waste of resources and lives that could be spent on exploration and discovery. And Dexkar felt something like respect for this tiny creature who faced him without trembling. Friendship is not possible between conquerors and the conquered, he told her bluntly. Submit, and you may survive as subjects of the Dominion, or resist, and you will be exterminated, and those are your only options. Chen glanced at her colleagues, and something passed between them that Dexkar could not interpret, and then she looked back at him with an expression he would later recognize as determination. "If you insist on war, then we must warn you," she said calmly. "Humans are very good at learning, and we hold grudges for a very, very long time, and we will remember every ship you destroy and every person you kill, and we will make you regret teaching us what we are capable of." The other humans nodded in agreement, and one of them added something that made the Xkara scales prickle with an unfamiliar sensation. "Our history is filled with stories of people who underestimated humanity," the humans said. "They usually learn their mistake too late." Xkar left the station with his guards and returned to his ship, while trying to dismiss the encounter as meaningless bravado from a doomed species, but something about the way the humans had looked at him with their strange mix of sadness and resolve made him uneasy in a way he had not felt since his first battle decades ago. He ordered the fleet to take position at the edge of the system and sent the formal 30-day countdown to Earth. While his strategic officers began planning the invasion, the humans used those 30 days in ways that surprised Vrexian scouts who monitored their activities constantly. Instead of trying to flee or hiding their leadership, the humans broadcast their preparations openly and invited other species in nearby systems to observe. They built defensive satellites and weapons platforms at a pace that should have been impossible, and they trained civilian volunteers in basic combat and survival techniques. Most strangely, they sent messages to the Vrexian fleet that contained music and literature and recordings of human children asking the Vrexians to reconcile. Dirthixacker watched these messages with growing confusion because they showed him families and cities and artwork and all the things that would be destroyed when the invasion came. It felt like the humans were trying to make him see them as real people rather than targets, and he hated how well it was working when the 30 days ended. Dexkar stood on his bridge and gave the order to advance while telling himself that this would be like every other conquest, quick and decisive and ultimately meaningless in the long span of Vrexian history. He had no idea how wrong he was. The Vrexian fleet emerged from faster-than-light travel at the edge of Earth's system, and the Xkar immediately knew something was different because the tactical display lit up with thousands of contacts where there should have been dozens. Humans had transformed the space around their planet into a defensive maze that included satellites and weapons platforms and what appeared to be containers floating in carefully calculated orbits. Analysis that Xkar demanded while his crew worked frantically to categorize the threats. His tactical officer studied the data for several moments before responding with uncertainty in his voice. "Warp right. Many of the satellites appear to be kinetic weapons that use simple mass and velocity rather than energy weapons, and the containers appear to contain fissile materials arranged as mines. They are using nuclear devices as space mines." Another officer added with disbelief. "The radiation signatures suggest yields in the megaton range." Dexkar had encountered nuclear weapons before because many primitive species used them, but never had he seen them deployed in space as area denial weapons. The humans had apparently realized they could not match Vrexian shield technology, so instead they had created obstacles that did not need to penetrate shields, but simply needed to generate enough force to damage ships through kinetic impact. "Advance carefully," he ordered. While the fleet began moving toward Earth at reduced speed, deploy scanner drones ahead of the main force and map safe corridors through their defenses. The fleet moved forward in formation with the dreadnoughts leading and the smaller frigates and destroyers following behind in protective patterns that had worked for 3,000 years. Then, the humans opened fire and everything changed. The kinetic satellites released their payloads at velocities that Vrexian shields were designed to deflect, but the sheer number of projectiles overwhelmed individual ship defenses. A frigate on the fleet's right flank took 3 tungsten rods through its forward section and lost power while drifting out of formation. The nuclear mines detonated in coordinated waves that created electromagnetic pulses and radiation bursts and blast effects that rattled even the heavy dreadnought shield 6. Watched as human ships began emerging from behind Earth's moon where they had been hiding, and they moved in patterns that suggested coordination beyond what radio communication could achieve. "They are using quantum entanglement communication," science officer reported with shock. "Each ship is in instantaneous contact with every other ship and with ground control, which means they can coordinate at distances where our communications have light speed delay." The human ships were smaller and weaker, and individually they posed no threat to Vrexian vessels, but they attacked in swarms that focused fire on single targets until shields failed. 3 human corvettes rammed a Vrexian destroyer in quick succession after their weapons were exhausted, and the combined impact cracked the destroyer's hull like an egg. They are using suicide tactics, his second officer said with horror, because ramming was considered disgraceful. In Vrexian culture, who would waste warriors in such a manner? But the humans kept coming, and their tactics showed creativity that the Xkar had never encountered in thousands of battles. They used debris from destroyed ships as projectiles by detonating explosives that sent metal fragments into Vrexian formations. They hacked into Vrexian communication channels and broadcast confusing orders that disrupted coordination until the fleet switched to secured frequencies. They even used their own destroyed satellites as improvised weapons by timing their orbital decay to intersect with Vrexian flight paths. Battle raged for 6 hours, and the Vrexians won because they had superior firepower and shields and numbers, but the cost was staggering. 12 frigates destroyed and 5 destroyers crippled, and even 2 dreadnoughts damaged badly enough to require withdrawal for repairs. The humans had lost over 70% of their fleet, but every single destroyed ship had taken Vrexian vessels with it, or had damaged multiple targets before Xkar stood on his bridge and watched human escape pods drifting in the debris field, and he ordered them recovered because prisoners could provide intelligence. But when his boarding parties opened the pods, they found that most were empty and had been launched purely to waste Vrexian resources on recovery operations. The few that did contain humans held injured crew members who had recordings playing on loop that showed their Xkar faces of human children and families and loved ones who would die when the Vrexians won it. Was psychological warfare designed to make the Vrexians see their victims as people and one. Xkar hated how effective it was prepare for planetary assault. He ordered while pushing away the strange feelings the human tactics had created. We will land ground forces at major population centers and force their surrender through occupation. The landing craft descended through Earth's atmosphere and met resistance that defied all logical military doctrine. Human aircraft attacked with missiles and bombs, despite being hopelessly outmatched, and when they were shot down, the pilots often aimed their dying craft at Vrexian positions. Ground forces engaged Vrexian warriors with weapons that ranged from advanced railguns to primitive chemical firearms to improvised explosives built from agricultural fertilizer. Humans fought from buildings and tunnels and sewers, and they used tactics that showed they had studied every battle the Vrexians had ever fought. They targeted Vrexian supply lines and communication nodes and command posts with precision that suggested detailed intelligence about Vrexian military structure. Xkar landed with the assault force in a city the humans called Beijing, and found urban warfare that made space combat look simple by comparison. Building was a potential fortress, and every street could hide ambush positions, and the humans showed no inclination to surrender. Even when surrounded, a Vrexian platoon cleared a residential building and found a single human defending it with a rifle and improvised traps. Human killed for Vrexian warriors before being cornered and then detonated an explosive vest then be captured. This pattern repeated across every landing zone, and Xkar realized with growing alarm that the humans had somehow obtained detailed information about Vrexian biology. Their weapons were calibrated to frequencies that disrupted Vrexian nervous systems, and their poisons were designed to bypass Vrexian metabolic filters. Captured human soldiers, when interrogated, simply smiled and said that humanity had been preparing for this fight since the meeting at the space station. Knew you would come, one prisoner told Xkar through a translator. So we learned everything we could about how to hurt you. The ground campaign bogged down into brutal street fighting that consumed resources at an unsustainable rate. Xkar controlled major cities, but the countryside remained hostile, and human resistance showed no signs of breaking then. The humans triggered their final surprise, and Xkar finally understood what the 30 days had really been for every piece of electronic equipment on Earth and in orbit simultaneously failed as a massive electromagnetic pulse swept through the system. The EMP was triggered by humans, detonating nuclear weapons in their own upper atmosphere, sacrificing their infrastructure. To disable both fleets in the chaos that followed as Vrexian ships lost power and drifted helplessly, Vextar watched thousands of small human vessels launch from hidden positions. These ships were shielded against the EMP, and they scattered in every direction, leaving the solar system on courses that would take them throughout the galaxy. His science officer managed to analyze one before it jumped too faster than light speed, and the report made Dexcar's blood-run Cold War prime. The vessels contain complete databases of Vrexian technology in biology and military tactics. The officer said they also contain detailed records of this battle and instructions for building the weapons and defenses. Humanity used Dexcar, realized what the humans had done, and the genius of it made him feel something close to fear. They had never intended to win the battle for Earth, had used the battle as a demonstration and as a way to buy time for their seed ships to escape carrying everything needed to wage war against the Dominion. The humans had just weaponized information and scattered it across the galaxy where any species could use it to resist. Rexian Conquest Ambassador Chen's warning echoed in the Dexcar's memory about humans being good at learning and holding grudges. She had been telling him exactly what would happen, and he had been too arrogant to listen. 10 years after the siege of Earth, the Vrexian Dominion controlled less territory than they had in 500 years, and Scar had been promoted to Supreme Commander because every leader above him had been killed or disgraced by the deteriorating situation. The seed ships humanity had launched during the EMP had reached 47 different systems, and in each one they had shared their data with species that the Vrexians had conquered or were in the process of conquering. The results had been catastrophic for the Dominion on the industrial world of Kethix Prime, which the Vrexians had occupied for 60 years. A rebellion erupted using weapons and tactics copied directly from Earth's defense. The Kethral workers, who had been forced to manufacture Vrexian equipment, suddenly knew exactly which components were critical and which facilities were most vulnerable. They sabotaged production lines and destroyed stockpiles, and when Vrexian reinforcements arrived, they found an organized resistance using improvised explosives and urban warfare techniques that looked eerily familiar. The rebellion succeeded, and the Kethral became the first species to throw off Vrexian occupation in recorded history. On Porthex 7, a species of aquatic beings called the Dilmai used human-designed submarines and underwater weapons to attack Vrexian mining operations. Vrexians had always been weak in aquatic environments, and the Dilmai exploited this ruthlessly, while human advisors provided tactical support remotely across a dozen systems. Similar patterns emerged as conquered species suddenly had access to information that leveled the playing field. They learned that Rexian shields were vulnerable to certain frequencies, and that Rexian warriors had blind spots in their peripheral vision, and that Vrexian supply chains depended on specific choke points. But the information warfare was only part of humanity's strategy. Human survivors who had escaped Earth on the seed ships became something the galaxy had never seen before, which was professional revolutionaries and teachers who moved from system to system spreading knowledge. Human named Marcus Webb spent 3 years on Talvex teaching the insectoid Talvin how to manufacture human-style railguns from mining equipment. Another human called Sarah Okonkwo lived among the Methier and helped them develop encrypted communication networks that Vexian intelligence could not crack. These humans did not try to control the rebellions or claim authority over other species, but instead they acted as consultants and friends who genuinely wanted to help others resist tyranny. Learned local languages and customs, and they adapted human tactics to fit each species' unique biology. And Kultrith Dexcar tracked their movements through intelligence reports and found himself developing something like respect for these fragile beings, who gave up comfortable lives to fight for strangers. But respect did not mean mercy, and he sent kill teams after every known human operative with orders to eliminate them before they could spread more dissent. The kill teams usually failed because the humans had learned to blend into alien populations, and because the species they helped protected them fiercely. Meanwhile, humanity itself had not been idle after Earth's devastation. The survivors who remained in the solar system rebuilt their world with determination that bordered on obsession. They cleared the rubble of destroyed cities and constructed new ones with better defenses. They established colonies on Mars and the moons of Jupiter and the asteroid belt, creating a distributed civilization that could not be destroyed by a single strike hand. They continued advancing their technology. At a pace that terrified Vrexian scientists, human ships began appearing in Vrexian-controlled space using stealth technology that made them nearly invisible to sensors. These vessels did not engage in direct combat, but instead they observed and gathered intelligence and occasionally destroyed isolated Vrexian outposts before vanishing. The Vrexians could not catch them and could not predict where they would strike next. Human cyber warfare became so sophisticated that Vrexian fleet communications were compromised multiple times, and each time the Vrexians developed new encryption, the humans broke it within months. Xcar received reports of human agents infiltrating Vrexian-occupied worlds, not to sabotage, but to educate the local population about Vrexian weaknesses. They set up secret schools and distributed information through underground networks and created cultures of resistance that were nearly impossible to suppress. In the mining colony of Vresh, a human teacher named David Park spent 5 years living among the Vrishi laborers. He taught them mathematics and science, using methods that made learning easy, and he showed them how to analyze their own oppression logically. When the Vrixians finally discovered the school and raided it, they found the students had already graduated and spread throughout the colony. The entire labor force went on strike simultaneously, and when Vrexian overseers tried to force them back to work, the Vrishi fought back with coordinated tactics. The colony became ungovernable, and the Vrexians were forced to withdraw, leaving the Vrishi to govern themselves. David Park was captured during the raid, and Xcar interrogated him personally, wanting to understand what motivated these humans. "Why do you fight for species you never knew before this war?" Xcar asked, while the humans sat calmly, despite being restrained. "What do you gain from teaching slaves to rebel?" David smiled, and his answer was simple: "Because it is right." Dexcar repeated with scorn in his voice. "Morality is a luxury for the strong, and you are not strong enough to enforce your version of right." "Maybe not alone," David agreed, "but we are not alone anymore, and every species we help becomes stronger, and every Vrexian defeat makes you weaker, and eventually the balance tips." Dexcar had David executed because keeping him alive risked another rescue attempt by human operatives, but the conversation haunted him. The humans were waging a war of attrition that the Dominion could not win because it was not based on military strength, but on ideas that spread like disease through populations and could not be bombed or conquered. The Vrexian economy began to collapse under the strain of fighting rebellions on multiple fronts. Resources that should have gone to expansion were diverted to occupation and suppression. New conquests became impossible because the fleet was stretched too thin, protecting existing territory. Recruitment numbers dropped as young Vrexians questioned why they should die for an empire that was clearly failing. Fexer watched the Dominion crumble and understood that humanity had done something unprecedented. They had turned the Vrexians' greatest strength, which was their military might, into a weakness by forcing them to fight everywhere at once. Humans had created a galaxy-wide insurgency that fed on Vrexian resources like a parasite. Most disturbing was humanity's patience. Human lifespans were short compared to Vrexians, but they treated the war as a multi-generational project. Children born after the siege of Earth were raised on stories of the resistance and trained in the tactics their parents had developed. They named ships after fallen heroes that encoded tactical data into songs and artwork that preserved knowledge across decades. A human diplomat named Jennifer Shao contacted Vrexian colonial governors and offered them deals. "Stop persecuting the local population and we will stop targeting your facilities," she would say. "Treat them fairly, and we will help you maintain order." Some governors accepted and found that cooperation was easier than constant warfare. These governors were quietly removed by Vrexian high command, but their replacements found the same situation waiting. The cost of maintaining the Dominion through force alone was becoming unsustainable. Assembled what remained of the Vrexian fleet and made one final attempt to strike at humanity's heart. He led an armada to the solar system, intending to destroy Earth completely and end the rebellion at its source. But when he arrived, he found the system transformed into a fortress defended by not just humans, but by representatives from 40 different species. The coalition fleet that opposed him included Kethril dreadnoughts and Dilmai submarines converted for space combat, and Talvin fighters and ships from dozens of other species, all of them flying in formation and coordinating with the quantum communication networks that humans had taught them to build for the first time in 3,000 years. Rexian fleet faced opponents who were organized and motivated and technologically equal. The battle lasted 3 days and ended in stalemate, with both sides taking heavy loss. Sexer withdrew to Rexian space and finally accepted what he had known for years. Dominion had lost and humanity had won, not through strength, but through persistence and cooperation and the willingness to fight for ideals rather than conquest. The question now was whether the Rexians would accept peace or fight to extinction. 20 years after first contact between humans and Rexians, the war finally came to the Rexian homeworld, and Thexkar stood on a planet he had not visited in decades, watching the coalition fleet assemble in orbit. The fleet contained ships from 63 different species united under a banner that showed Earth's sun surrounded by stars representing every member of the coalition. Thexar had spent 2 decades fighting this war, and he had aged in ways that went beyond physical years. His scales had dulled, and scars covered his body from battles that should never have been necessary. If the humans had simply submitted like every other species, the Supreme Commander looked at the tactical display and saw that his own fleet was outnumbered 3-1 by vessels that used Rexian technology mixed with human innovations. The Kethril had improved Rexian shield designs, and the Dilmai had created better weapons targeting systems, and the Talvon had miniaturized power cores for greater efficiency. Every species in the coalition had contributed something unique, and together they had created a combined force that was superior to anything that Dominion could field. Thexkar's advisors argued for fighting to the last warrior because surrender was unthinkable for a species that had never lost. But Thexkar had learned things in 20 years that challenged everything he had believed about strength and honor. He had watched human prisoners choose death rather than betray their allies. He had seen conquered species rise up. Despite knowing they would probably die, he had observed parents teaching their children resistance tactics so the fight would continue after they were gone. These things had no place in Rexian culture, which valued individual strength and survival above all else. Yet somehow these weaker species with their strange values had defeated the mightiest empire in the galaxy. Communication requests came from the coalition flagship, and Thexkar accepted it, knowing that this conversation would determine the fate of his species. The hologram that appeared showed Admiral Sarah Chen, who had been a child when her grandmother, Ambassador Chen, first met Thexkar, wore the uniform of the United Species Coalition, and she had her grandmother's eyes and the same calm expression. Supreme Commander Thexkar, she said formally, I am authorized to offer terms for ending this war. Thexkar braced himself for demands of unconditional surrender and mass executions, and the complete dismantling of Rexian civilization. Instead, Admiral Chen outlined terms that were surprisingly moderate: complete withdrawal from all conquered systems, within 5 years reparations, paid in technology and resources too. Species the Rexians had harmed acceptance of coalition observers on Rexian worlds to ensure compliance, and, most surprisingly, cultural exchange programs to help Rexians integrate peacefully into the galactic community. You could demand more, Thexkar said suspiciously. You could occupy our worlds and enslave our people as we did to others, but instead you offer us a path to peace. Admiral Chen nodded, and her expression became thoughtful. We could do those things, she agreed, but then we would become what we fought against, and the cycle would continue besides, she added, with something that might have been sadness. We have learned that most Phyrexian civilians never wanted this war, and were just following leaders who told them conquest was their destiny. This was true, though Thexkar had never admitted it even to himself. Dominion had been built by warrior elites who convinced the population that expansion was necessary for survival. What if we refuse your terms, Thexkar asked. Though we already knew he would accept, then we will destroy your military capability completely and occupy your homeworld until you accept terms that will be much harsher. Admiral Chen said bluntly, "We do not want to do this because occupation breeds resentment, and resentment breeds future conflict, but we will do it if necessary." Dexcar studied the human admiral and saw his own weariness reflected in her face. This war had cost humanity dearly, with Earth still recovering from the devastation, and millions dead in battles across the galaxy, yet they still offered peace rather than revenge. "I have a question before I answer," Lexcar said slowly. "Why did you fight at all when you could have hidden or fled or simply accepted subjugation, Admiral?" Chen was quiet for a moment, and when she spoke, her voice carried the weight of 2 decades of war, because if we did not stop you, then you would have found someone else to hurt, and that is not a galaxy we want to live in. Humans do not just fight for ourselves, she continued. We fight for what we think is right, and we fight for those who cannot fight for themselves. And we never give up, even when giving up would be easier. That is not strength, Dexcar argued, though his conviction was wavering. That is foolishness that wastes resources on strangers, maybe Admiral Chen allowed. But it is the foolishness that built this coalition and defeated your empire and created a galaxy where cooperation is stronger than conquest. Then Scar looked at the tactical display again and saw ships from species that had hated each other for centuries. Flying in perfect formation, the humans had done what the Vrexians never could, which was unite the galaxy through common cause rather than common fear. "What happens to warriors like me if we accept peace?" he asked quietly. "We were bred for war and trained for nothing else." Admiral Chen's expression softened slightly. "You learn new purposes," she said. "Some former Vrexian warriors have joined the coalition peacekeeping forces, where they use their skills to protect rather than conquer others, have become teachers or engineers or explorers. And they find that building is more satisfying than destroying. It will not be easy," she admitted, "but humans believe that people can change and grow beyond what they were taught to be." Dexcar made his decision and signaled his fleet to stand down while opening a channel to broadcast to all Vexian forces. "This is Supreme Commander Dexcar," he said in the formal cadence used for official proclamations. "The war is over, and we will accept the coalition's terms for peace." The response from his own forces was mixed, with some ships powering down immediately, while others broadcast outrage and accusations of cowardice. A handful of Rexian vessels broke formation and attempted suicide runs on the coalition fleet. Human and allied ships disabled them with precision fire that destroyed weapons and engines, while avoiding killing blows. Even in victory, the coalition showed restraint, and the Dexcar understood that this was the fundamental difference. The Vrexians had always maximized destruction because they could, while the coalition minimized it because they should. The peace treaty was signed aboard a neutral station with representatives from every coalition species present. Dexcar placed his claw mark on the document that ended 3,000 years of Vrexian expansion and felt something unexpected, which was relief. The burden of maintaining the empire through endless war had crushed generations of Vrexian leaders. Now that burden was lifted, and his species could discover what they might become without its ambassador. The Chen, the original ambassador, now elderly and frail, attended the signing ceremony in a wheelchair. She approached Dexcar afterward and looked up at him with knowing eyes. "I told you at our first meeting that humans hold grudges," she said with a slight smile, "but I did not tell you that we also forgive when forgiveness is earned. Your species has much to atone for," she continued seriously. "But if you work with us to repair the damage and build something better, then, perhaps in time, Galaxy will remember you for what you became rather than what you were." Dexcar knelt before her, which shocked the Brexian delegation because kneeling was a sign of submission that warriors never showed. "I underestimated your species because you were physically weak," he said. "Honestly, I did not understand that strength comes in forms that cannot be measured by weapons or armor." Ambassador Chen reached out with a trembling hand and touched his scarred snout gently. "You understand now," she said. "That is what matters." In the years that followed, the galaxy transformed as Vrexian technology and resources were redirected toward peaceful purposes. Former war fleets became exploration vessels that charted unknown regions of space. Vrexian engineers worked alongside humans and other species to build megastructures and terraform planets. The warrior culture slowly evolved as young Vrexians grew up without the constant drumbeat of conquest. They learned that honor could be found in protecting the weak rather than dominating them. Texgar lived another 40 years and spent them as a teacher at the Coalition Military Academy, where former enemies trained together. He taught strategy and tactics to students from dozens of species, and he always began his courses with the same story. The story of how the galaxy's most feared species found their match in a small blue planet whose people refused to accept that might makes right. He told his students about Ambassador Chen, asking about Brexian music, while facing extinction, about David Park teaching mathematics to slaves because it was right, about Admiral Chen offering peace instead of revenging. He ended every class with the same lesson. The humans taught us that true strength is not the power to destroy, but the courage to build and the wisdom to choose cooperation over conflict. They showed us that the most feared species in the galaxy is not the one with the strongest weapons, but the one that never stops fighting for what they believe in. We were the galaxy's apex predators for 3,000 years, he would say, but we were not strong because we were feared, but weak because we only knew how to make others fear you.